Welcome everyone, I'm Dr. Priti Parikh, Head of Engineering for International Development Research Center at UCL, and I'm going to talk about transforming infrastructure through UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'm also part of the Energy and Development Network at UCL, which is a group of interdisciplinary academics working on various issues in relation to energy access and energy systems. And jointly 3 years ago, we identified published evidence of synergies and trade-offs between SDG 7, which is energy, and the 169 SDGs targets. Through this exercise, very interesting exercise, what we found that actually there were synergies between energy and 143 of the 169 targets. What this really means is action and investment in energy has a knock-on impact on all the other goals and can really leverage and deliver on human well-being and development. So action and investment in energy systems is vital. And if we break it down a bit more, what energy systems does, it kind of leverages and ensures well-being and welfare. So it results in poverty reduction, access to healthcare, education, water sanitation systems. It enables investment in other forms of infrastructure, whether it's food systems, water systems, medical facilities, sustainable cities, and renewable and energy efficient solutions will be required as we move towards a low carbon transition. But in realizing this dream, it's worth noting that there could be some trade-offs as well. So for example, when we invest in energy systems, we need to be considerate of potential trade-offs with local communities and their well-being and their aspirations and needs. Also, quite often large infrastructure projects can have a detrimental impact on other forms of infrastructure. And when we talk about scaling up energy systems and investment in energy systems, it's worth bearing in mind that we do really need to focus on clean energy systems. Otherwise, that would have a detrimental impact on climate change and pollution. But overall, our work, our systematic process of review at UCL found that energy systems are a foundation for socio-economic development and can affect delivery of outcomes across all the SDGs. And hence, it is our duty to support access to energy systems. And part of that is also considering how us and universities engage with the private sector. Because if we think about the off-grid sector, and locations where grid access is limited, those solutions, quite a lot of them are powered through the private sector. So I believe that academics moving forward will need to work and engage with the private sector to ensure affordable, clean energy services for all, to ensure equity and justice. We also replicated this exercise for the off-grid solar sector in Rwanda, where we found that action and favorable policies in the off-grid solar sector led to synergies between off-grid sector and 85 of the SDG targets. So once again, this demonstrates that if we have a favorable policy environment for the off-grid sector, there's potential to achieve impact and well-being across all goals. And this is an important point because especially looking at my work in Sub-Saharan Africa, and my current fellowship, which is in partnership with Royal Academy of Engineering in the private sector, what we are finding is that conventional grid solutions are not working there, and hence there's a need to scale up off-grid energy solutions. But unfortunately, there's still a gap in research around this sector, especially nations with low levels of electrification, are the nations where you also see gaps in evidence and gaps in research. And there's almost a slight lag between an active dynamic private sector involvement and academia. And I think this is where universities will play a vital role in facilitating this just and equitable transition to clean energy. We also translated this approach to a different form of infrastructure, which is sanitation. And once again, we found that action and investment in sanitation had synergies with 130 of the 169 goals. And once again, demonstrating that action in infrastructure has an overall impact on achieving the sustainable development goals. And interestingly enough, there we found that addressing sanitation addresses all the goals in relation, all the targets So addressing sanitation and addresses all the targets in relation to energy, and vice versa. We found in our mapping exercise for energy that there were close linkages with sanitation. And our ambition at UCL is to continue building this data set with more published evidence and be even more transdisciplinary, because the reality is that our planet is facing complicated challenges through complex systems. We are facing challenges like globalization, climate change, and we will all need to work together and break down traditional disciplinary silos. And we are developing now more context-specific applications and case studies of our structured process. And we believe the future for our work here at UCL to influence the sector and thinking on SDGs is to develop tools for monitoring and evaluation, working with policymakers, working with practitioners, working with governments to ensure that achievements to SDG are monitored and further action is harmonized in this section. And we also believe that there needs to be harmonized investment and action for SDGs, for which evidence-driven approaches will be required. And this is where universities, and especially UCL, can play a vital role in bringing forward this evidence to foster cross-sectoral partnerships and collaborations. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sam Mason from the Public and Commercial Services Trade Union. I'm going to do a short PowerPoint presentation here for the Beyond Borders Energy Transition section. The energy choices towards decarbonisation and trade union perspective, which we are calling a justice pathway, because we strongly believe that the future of energy transition has to be rooted in justice aspirations. One thing for trade unions that we have collective agreement at the energy transition should also be about public ownership of energy, and this is a motion that we passed in 2019 at TEC Congress, and as you can see, calls on the TEC to commit to full reclaiming of the power sector to public ownership, so that's on generation, transmission, distribution and to supply. And given this was in September 2019, obviously the Labour Party then was very much talking about public ownership, particularly the transmission and distribution of energy. So this was been reinforcing that policy across the Labour movement. As we know, of course, the Labour Party then went on not to win the election, and we're now in a different place, but that remains very much trade union agreement. However, we're not in agreement across other issues. So, for example, in the energy mix, particularly the so-called energy unions support nuclear energy, for example. Many unions don't. They support the GMB union, which is a gas union, supports blue hydrogen for as a way of decarbonising heat. But of course, that's linked to negative emissions technologies such as carbon capture and storage, which again, many unions also disagree with, from the context that we're actually not dealing with the issue in the long term of decarbonisation. We also disagree on decarbonisation targets. So, for example, my union would advocate for 2030 decarbonisation in line with the IPCC and science, whereas other unions, such as GMB and Unite to some extent, would argue that it has to be a 2050 decarbonisation target. But we do agree around fuel poverty, and that any energy transition needs to address wider issues around fuel, energy policy, retrofit installation, and this idea of universality and affordability and energy as a public good. Again, just transition, a term which many of you may now be familiar with. This, again, is a contested term within the trade union movement around the limits of a just transition versus what we would argue for as a just transformation, or transformational just transition that actually looks at wider issues of social and economic justice. But again, it's about ensuring that the jobs as we move out of transition are decent jobs and unionised. And why do we talk about climate justice? Well, it's going back to those issues of social and economic justice, that it's not just about energy and replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy, but we also have to see energy in its wider context related to issues of health, finance, the economy, social impacts on the environment, the political processes, participative democracy and control, who gets to decide pathways, including communities that are impacted by energy transition, ensure social justice within the transition process for workers and communities, again, come back to affordability, and also that decarbonisation is understood in terms of the different impacts. Again, if we go back to carbon capture and storage, we're storing the problem up for future generations again. And in that broader aspect of climate justice, we're not really dealing in the long term. The Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, a number of UK unions are part of a global initiative called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, which puts forward an alternative just transition paradigm that is predicated on the notion that we all agree around public ownership and democratic control of energy. And its foundational document, Resist, Reclaim, Restructure, which is referenced here on this slide, talks about resisting the fossil fuel corporations, reclaiming them back into public ownership and restructuring them around ways of and forms of democratic control. But again, we have these discussions around, do we negotiate or have this energy transition as part of a social dialogue approach or part of a social power approach, and somewhere in between. We also need to think of energy as a system, not just its inputs and outputs. So therefore, we assess how we understand energy, whether it's power sector, heating, cooling, which are becoming closer together, and see it's part of a whole economy approach. So, for example, including in the transport sector, housing, construction, agriculture, and not just looking at demand, but about what we use energy for, why we use energy, and not trying to bolt on a decarbonisation to the current system. Abstract to the whole system of energy and what we need for it, and understandably profit in the market basis drives us a lot to this end. But again, it needs to be based around economic, social, environmental and political justice. And finally, social just transition, again, workers and communities. So this is key for trade unionists and how the energy transition will impact. But also to ensure through some transformative responses that also address issues of race, disability, gender justice, not just macho jobs, so that the current jobs are replicated within a renewable sector, that we look more broadly around a number of these issues and look for the reinstatement of collective bargaining to ensure leverage against powerful employers, decarbonisation design, the gas industry, for example, real skills and training programs for workers and communities, and apprenticeships and jobs that respond to the long-term future, just not the immediate need, and the creation of what we would call climate jobs, jobs that lower greenhouse emissions, for example, in retrofit, and an idea of a new energy worker that embodies lots of different skills and knowledge around energy, and social protections being key for workers in transition in terms of their livelihood, but also looking at that on a kind of longer term process, not just as a sort of redundancy package, but something that creates a meaningful future and work for workers and trade unions. So I will just stop sharing my screen there. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Firstly, a warm thanks to UCL for convening this exciting and important discussion. Access to clean modern energy is a sustainable development goal in its own right, but it also underpins a host of other SDGs, as well as delivery of the Paris Agreement. Over the last 10 to 20 years, the cost of clean energy has fallen dramatically, due in no small part to the efforts of researchers at universities around the world. The cost of solar panels has fallen 90% since 2009, and the cost of wind has fallen by 55 to 60% since 2010. In many, if not most countries, clean energy is now competitive with fossil fuels. Nonetheless, despite the improving economics of a low carbon energy transition, public policy, and particularly public finance, too often continues to favour high carbon energy over renewables and other clean energy. ODI, working with partners, has found that G20 countries pledged $223 billion to fossil fuels since the pandemic began in January of this year, as new money as part of their fiscal stimulus packages. 52% of all energy spending in these stimulus packages has flowed to fossil fuel energy, compared to 35% for clean energy, with the remainder going to nuclear and large hydropower. The Energy Policy Tracker by ODI and partners found that countries differed hugely in the way that they allocated their fiscal stimulus package in terms of the carbon intensity. The US and the UK spent a huge share of their energy spending on fossil fuels, whereas France, Germany, and China have pivoted and spent a majority of their energy funds on clean energy. Where countries are still choosing to use taxpayer money to prop up fossil fuels, they are making a choice to condemn future generations and other species to what may well be an uninhabitable Earth. We need to pivot and reform our fiscal and financial systems to consistently support a clean energy transition. So what might this involve? Economists, guilty as charged, would usually respond with a carbon price. This would be the most simple and efficient solution. And already carbon pricing is taking off, with over 45 countries around the world having a carbon price in place. But if we look at examples like Australia, which briefly had the highest carbon price in the world from 2012 to 2014, or France, which was recently, before the pandemic struck, rocked with the yellow vest protests, it's clear that governments need to introduce a much wider range of policies in order to ensure that the energy transition has a depth of public support, and particularly to do this by ensuring that the costs and trade-offs of an energy transition are borne equitably. Perhaps we can also learn something here from those countries that have successfully reformed fossil fuel subsidies, which are, after all, a negative carbon price. Indonesia, for example, managed to significantly cut its subsidies for petrol and diesel in 2014. How did it do this? I think there were two key ingredients. The first was timing. Oil prices dropped dramatically in 2014, and so the Indonesian government was able to take advantage of lower market prices. It's worth noting that oil prices have also dropped very recently, offering a new opportunity for fossil fuel subsidy reform, which countries like Nigeria have grabbed. But the second factor in Indonesia's successful fossil fuel subsidy reform was the government's close attention to social justice. The money that had been spent on fossil fuels was reallocated to social welfare, such as health insurance, cash transfers, support for students, and low interest loans for small businesses, as well as infrastructure that would serve the poorest communities. And this brings me to the critical point. A clean energy transition and clean energy infrastructure is not just a story about technology. It's a story about the cost of living, about people's aspirations for a better life. It's about economic competitiveness and international geopolitics. It's about air quality and so much more. Universities have done a huge amount to drive down the cost of energy technologies and to identify and evaluate policy instruments that can help those technologies to achieve scale. Now we need research more than ever, particularly in the political arena, building an evidence base on how we deliver an energy transition that averts climate catastrophe, but also delivers improved living standards today, particularly by serving low-income and marginalised communities, wherever they may be. It's a huge challenge, and I'm really excited to work with UCL on it.
Hi there, I'm Adam Harrison from Camden Council. I'm a councillor, cabinet member with responsibility for sustainability. We also have UCL in our borough, which we're very happy about. Just going to talk very quickly about participative approaches to environmental policy in Camden. I'm mostly going to focus on last year's Climate Assembly. I'll just draw out a couple of themes. One is the role of political leadership and of universities in this whole agenda and how they intersect. So in the sense, you've got our council leader, Georgia Gould, who's been leading on introducing more participatory approaches in Camden for the last few years. So Camden 2025, the words behind her, was our wide-ranging initiative to engage our citizens in what the council's priorities should be. On the left, you've got our Clean Air Action Plan, which we also devised through participatory approaches. And on the right is our MP, Keir Starmer, who helped launch that plan. He's now leader of the British Labour Party. UCL's Professor of Citizen Science, Muki Hackley, helped in the design day for the Clean Air Action Plan. You can just about see him in the centre there. And we also had really useful, vital really input from King's College London, who conducted a study into the future of air quality in the borough and the impact our own policies would have. So a number of things coming together on the clean air. Following on from that, we introduced the Citizens Assembly on the climate crisis in 2019 because of the growing concern about climate, and because we wanted to, we had this understanding that we would only be able to make the progress we need to if we involve as many people as we can. And to hear their recommendations, to hear where they're at, and to be able to then communicate that back and work with our citizens on making deeper change. So in the run-up to the Assembly, we conducted a number of engagement events. So one was online, so you can see the map on the right with the pins in. So that was asking for our citizens' ideas, citizens who weren't necessarily going to be in the Assembly, open to everybody. We set up, created these fact sheets, which you can see on the left, to help inform and educate people. We work with our schools, so we've set up a group called the Sustainers, of young environmentalists in the council, again with the lead of the council heavily involved in that. On the right, we've got a picture of one of the business roundtables that we conducted. So business is obviously hugely important to making the inroads we need to in carbon emissions, and also particularly in Camden, which as a borough hosts around 2% of the country's GDP. So the Citizens Assembly itself was 3 sessions over July. So first was talk about the climate science, where UCL actually contributed as one of the presenters. Secondly, was starting to discuss potential ideas, and then finally was an action day where the citizens eventually whittled down and voted on and adopted 17 recommendations, a couple of which I will show in a moment. UCL also had a really important role in facilitating and advising on how to run the Assembly, and then later on in evaluating the whole process, and that evaluation can be found online on the Camden website. It's really interesting reading. Just a few of the recommendations that the citizens proposed. So installing more segregated cycle lanes, for example, which we're now actually doing as part of a COVID response. Retrofit is there, community energy is there. The Citizens Assembly proposals were put to the full council of all the councillors in Camden in October last year, the Assembly having taken place in July. We also declared a climate emergency at that time. Citizens were able to speak at the event in the council chamber at the meeting, which you can see on the right, and on the left that's me speaking, and all the councillors about to adopt the motion. But between that July and October, we didn't really want to let things die down, so we set up a summer of social action, if you will. So on the top left, you can see really, attractively painted shopfront, which is in Kentish Town, one of our main high streets, which is an open shopfront for people to come in, to learn about climate, for lots of events to take place in. That eventually became a cafe at the beginning of the year. So again, still with a strong environmental theme until COVID came along and stopped that for the moment. And they're currently looking for a new home. But the Think and Do Camden is still active online. So you can see a tweet from just a few days ago, which I've highlighted because it mentions the Camden Forest, which you can see there. And that was, the Camden Forest was really one of the initiatives that came out of that summer of action. It's about people in the community reaching out to others, their neighbours, about planting up particularly private gardens. So that's a really useful connection in for the council, and to be working with the community to achieve broader aims in reaching places that probably we wouldn't be able to normally reach on our own. Just on the top right, I've just highlighted some text as well. You can see the Camden Climate Citizen Panel. So this is another ongoing process that's come out of the Assembly. We want to make sure there is some continuous scrutiny of the council. So there's 15 citizens who've been recruited who will be in post for a number of years, and will be looking at the council's work and scrutinising us and pressing us to do more. So that's also come out of the Citizens Assembly. Just highlight a couple of infrastructure pieces of work we're doing as well. On the left is a connection between our decentralised energy network in Somerstown, in the centre of the borough, and you can see in the distance the world-renowned Francis Crick Institute, which we're hoping to create a connection between the network and the institute. And then on the right, this, one of our libraries with some solar panels. on top. So just to reflect, the Citizens Assembly was really a fantastic event, process in many ways. It was highly involving of the citizens. We adopted all their recommendations, including some very tough ones. I would say in both the Citizens Assembly and the Clean Air Plan, we didn't necessarily know to what extent that citizen-led policy making would present us with proposals that are extremely challenging to deliver. Some of them are, but my view is that we're really in a position where we're in a challenging situation, and if we're not able to deliver the policies that we need to deliver to reduce air pollution or combat climate change, then we have to be having that bigger conversation. We have to be taking that and turning it into that bigger conversation about powers and funding, and why we're not able to do these things at the moment. Just to recap a couple of the really important themes, it was really vital to have the political leadership from the leader of the council, the endorsement from the local MP, combining with that citizen participation and the role of universities, as you've seen at various points, advising on and underpinning our work in participatory policy making.